It's a good day. It's the last day of our series on worship. And as I said earlier, the series is called Pedestals. And 2 weeks ago, when we talked about the first week of the series, we talked about how we had a pedestal here, and like whatever we put on that is what tends to dictate the direction of our lives. And we showed how there's soccer teams and stuff, and they have these different mentalities, these different ideologies that their organization has. And as a result of that, some of them have had moments of success, but others have had decades of success. And it's the same thing with us. If worship is simply a moment for us, then that moment will always end. It will always end. But if worship becomes a lifestyle for us, then it actually allows us to live in this long-term level of stability. And not that our circumstances are always stable, but our hearts are. And we talked about, especially that first week, that worship is the act of putting God on that pedestal, or rather, maybe a more appropriate illustration is the act of putting God in the driver's seat of our life. And often we try and put a bunch of different things in that driver's seat, and that's when we tend to worship other things. We're beings who worship, not beings who might worship. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of what. And so when we worship, we're putting something in the driver's seat of our life. That's what we talked about the first week. Last week, we talked about old gods, same gods. We have all these gods that are mentioned in the Old Testament, right? Gods like Molech, and gods like Baal and Asheroth and all this stuff. And we talked about how it's funny because we tend to look back at that and God says, don't worship idols, don't worship all these graven images. Like, we just don't have that issue nowadays. And yet, the very things that those gods back then stood for are the very same things we worship today. And how what happens is when we worship idols, we find ourselves exiled. We find ourselves out of home, out of the place we want to be, really. And when we worship God, we find ourselves home. Wherever we're at, we find ourselves home. But the unfortunate result of the people of Israel, these people God had chosen, worshiping other gods, was they got to the point where they were literally sacrificing their own children to these gods. And that's such a horrible place to be, and yet that's the place that we get led to because we're willing to do whatever it takes to turn our lives around with whatever we can. And so we'll sacrifice our children to our work. We'll sacrifice our children to our own expectations of them, whatever it is. And so we get to bad places in our life today. But today I want to talk about something a little bit different, that we will often come to moments in our life where things are hard. And that can be an understatement. But I want to talk about worship in that context. And so I want to pray real quick, and we'll start talking about what to do when worship is hard. So let's pray. Lord, I want to thank you so much for everything that you've done for us. I want to thank you that you are a God who is amazing and loving and greater than we could ever imagine, that your mercies are new every single day. And Lord, I just ask that you would be in this place, that your Spirit would be in this place speaking through me, that you would make connections in hearts that I cannot make, and that we would all be able to commit to worshiping you, and even in the most difficult moments of our lives. Thank you so much, Lord, in your name. Amen. So, my wife was gone a couple weeks ago. She was gone for like a week. And so I had some extra time one evening. And on Netflix, there's this show called The Mist. And have you guys ever seen the movie The Mist? Probably not many of you. But it's based on a novel by Stephen King. And so that probably tells some of you a little bit about what it's about. But Stephen King, and I'm going to give this away. Is anyone going to watch The Mist? Cool. Okay, I'm going to give this away. So what happens is there's these people, and like the whole story of the movie is like everything's great, everyone's kind of living their normal lives, and they're somewhere in like Maine, and all of a sudden this mist descends on the town, and crazy stuff starts happening. And so people that went outside of buildings, all of a sudden, like, they'd hear noises and they wouldn't know what happened. So it's sort of a horror movie, but not like a demonic horror movie, a really like what's happening horror movie. And so you're sitting there watching this, and it's so crazy because people go nuts. I mean, I think what Stephen King is doing is he's exploring he's exploring the thin line between like normalcy in society and how it can just go to nonsense if stuff happens. And so it starts out and everything is going really well. The main characters, they go into the store, they're shopping, whatever it is. It's just really normal. And all of a sudden the mist comes and everyone's like, what is this? And then when the first bad things start happening, people get worried, but then the longer stuff goes without answers, all of a sudden you get these people who just, there's this, religious lady in this store, and it goes nuts. She starts saying that, we need to sacrifice somebody. It just goes nuts. And the point I'm trying to make is not about go watch the movie, but rather that what's really interesting is that there's this thing, there's this line, all of a sudden things go from good to bad, right? From good to bad. And everything can be going really well, and everything can be going really simply and smoothly and easily. But then all of a sudden, something comes up, and trial comes up, and difficulty comes up. And how do we react in those moments? And that's what I want to explore today, is how do we react in these moments where everything is going well, everything is going as it should, maybe things are going better than they should, and all of a sudden, bam, we hit that line where everything now is shifted and everything is going wrong. And the story I want to focus on today is in Daniel chapter 3. And some of you will know this story. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. But I want to give you some context to what we're talking about today. So last week we were talking about the Israelites and how worship will either get you to exile or will get you to home. And how home is this amazing place where you feel safe, secure, where everything is going as it should be. At least if things aren't going, you have a good family around you, all this stuff. But exile is to leave that home, to be places you don't want to be, doing things you don't want to do. Well, what happens to the Israelites, these people that God chose, they started off like, hey, God, we want to follow you. But then over time, they pretty much exiled themselves. They exiled their own hearts from God, and it resulted in other nations coming in and taking them out. And we talked about how it's so crazy because the Israelites, the only thing they had was God, right? They weren't a bigger nation. They were this tiny, you see this in movies more often than in real life, but there's that punk little kid who is really annoying and just weak little kid, but a punk, and everyone wants to do something to this kid, but his dad is there, so no one will touch him, right? But then the minute his dad is gone, all of a sudden it's free for all. And the reality is that was what Israel was. Israel was this tiny little nation that didn't have much going for it, except that God was on their side and he was going to protect them. But then they decide, well, we don't really want God around. And so now they're left with just them. And guess what? There's bigger nations around them. There's these other people who want to take them out. And that's what happens. So Israel gets taken because Israel was split into two. One of the groups gets taken by a nation called Assyria. The rest of them get taken by a nation called Babylon. And Babylon was an incredible nation at the time. I mean, it's one of the first empires that we see on earth that was in any sort of like I said, empire. Before that, it was mostly tribes and all of these little tiny localized things. But Babylon was the first kind of worldwide empire. It was the world that they knew, but it was worldwide for them. It was this huge nation. And the only thing separating Israel from being their captives was God. But then they said, we don't want God. We're worshiping other things. And so Babylon comes along, takes them into captivity. Anyways, the problem was that there were still some good people in Israel. There were still some people who wanted to follow God, but they got taken too. And some of these guys are Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is a side note, as a kid, I always heard it said Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not, it's Abednego. Anyways, that's just Bible trivia right there. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are guys who want to follow God. And the first place we see them is they're not taken into exile. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, says, I'm going to take all of these guys, these young men, these people of influence within this Jewish community, and I'm going to invite them into my palace to feed them and to give them things that are really good. And so he says, I'm going to feed you all the king's food, I'm going to do all this stuff. And it wasn't so much that this was against a belief system, but rather what Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do is he's trying to say, hey, you don't have to fight back. You don't have to have this rebellious attitude because I'm going to give you something good, right? And so often in our lives, God will, or Satan will sometimes kind of quiet our rebellious nature against sin, right? Because we don't like sin, we don't want it, and yet it feels good and we like it kind of, and that will kind of keep us comfortable, and that's what Satan does. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar was intending to do with these guys. And Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they all decide, you know what? We're not going to do it. We're gonna stay faithful to God. We're only going to eat fruits and vegetables. And guess what? Fruits and vegetables resulted in them being healthier than every single other person that the king saw. And so the king's like, wow, this is pretty cool. He sets them up in some pretty good ways. But then the next thing happens, and this is in chapter 2, it starts off. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has a dream. And he has this dream, and he doesn't want to tell anyone what it is, because he's perplexed, he doesn't know what it means, and he looks around at all of these guys who claim to know the gods, all these priests, all these guys, and he says, I want you to tell me what the dream is. And they're like, we can't do that. Like, come on, we can't do that. You got to tell us the dream, and then we'll try and interpret it. But he's perplexed, and he's like, no, I want you to tell me, or else I'm going to think that you're faking this whole thing, and I'm going to kill all of you. And they're like, we can't do it. And so Nebuchadnezzar is mad. He's angry, and so he decides, I'm going to kill all of the wise men, all of these guys. And Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they all get wrapped into that. They were never part of it, but they get wrapped into it. Because sometimes we get wrapped into stuff that was never our fault, and we feel like it's God's fault, but it's just the choices of other people in our lives. And so they get wrapped into this. And Daniel's like, hold up, let me go pray. I'm going to come back, tell you what it means. He comes back, he prays, and he says, this is what your dream was. And he describes what Nebuchadnezzar's dream was. There was this image, this statue, and it was made of a bunch of different metal. The head was gold, the body, the torso was silver, the two arms were silver, the waist and the thighs were all bronze, or the waist was bronze, the thighs and the legs were all iron. I'm definitely getting some of this mixed up. But anyways, I'm getting the order right. The iron, and then the feet were of clay and iron. They were mixed. And so what Daniel says, he says, listen, this is what it means. And he's kind of hesitant because he doesn't want to tell Nebuchadnezzar this because he knows that Nebuchadnezzar's probably not going to like this. But here's the meaning of this. Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold is your empire, is Babylon. That's what it is. And unfortunately, what's going to happen next is a kingdom, and Daniel's really, he knows how to speak diplomatically. A kingdom inferior to yours is going to take over your kingdom, right? Which doesn't make sense. But, it's obviously superior. But he doesn't want to offend anyone. So he's like, a kingdom inferior to yours is going to take over, and then there's going to be another one, and another one, and another one. And then there's the last part of the dream that is so cool to us as Christians, but not cool to Nebuchadnezzar, which was this. There's this statue, this image, and all of a sudden a stone, this huge stone that was not carved with human hands, comes out of nowhere, takes out the entire statue, and turns into a mountain that fills the entire earth, fills the whole thing. And at this point, you have to realize they probably thought the earth was flat. So, literally the whole, just think of a flat plate, just mountain. That's what Nebuchadnezzar saw. And so this is what Daniel sees, and he says, and that last thing is God. And it's his kingdom coming and filling the entire earth. And once and for all of these nations that have tried to act like they're superior and all this stuff, they'll never survive in the face of who God is. And Nebuchadnezzar is stoked because he's been so confused. He doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. And he's stoked on Daniel. He's just like, dude, you're the man. I'm going to put you in a position. He puts him in a position over the province of Babylon. So there was the empire of Babylon, but there's different provinces within it. And the main one was the province of Babylon. He's like, I'm putting you in charge of this. And Daniel, who's a good bro, he's just like, hey, I got 3 friends. They're really good. You're going to love them. And Nebuchadnezzar is like, yeah, sure, let's do this. So he puts Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in positions of authority within this province. Daniel stayed at the king's court while Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are out doing their own thing. Well, what happens next is pretty typical for us as human beings. Nebuchadnezzar is not happy he's stoked that he knows the meaning, but he's not stoked about the meaning, right? And so he decides, well, I think that my empire, my kingdom is going to last forever. I mean, like, look what I've built. No one else has done what I've done. Like, look what I have done. This is all because of me. And he builds an image. This is the next thing he does. He in a straight retaliation, straight like rebellion, is like, no. I get what you're saying, this guy that's trying to show me stuff, but I'm going to tell you how it really is. And he builds a 90-foot tall statue, at least overlaid, if not made fully of gold, right? And what he's saying, and we often say, oh, it's a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't. At least it was not said so. What it represents is that Babylon, what Nebuchadnezzar has created, built, and made into what it is going to last forever. And he brings everyone from all of the provinces all over his empire and says, you're going to come here, and when the music plays, you're going to bow down and worship it. Not so much worshiping Nebuchadnezzar, but rather worshiping what Babylon was. And by extension then, worshiping Nebuchadnezzar's wise, whatever wisdom and all this stuff. So this is where we come to in our story, right? All of this stuff has happened. We see all the characters, and now we come to this moment where all of these people are bowing down to it. Every single person is bowing down to it. But then we get to this in Daniel chapter 3, verses 8, and we're going to read through 15. Yeah, 15. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans, Babylonians, came forward and maliciously accused the Jews, right? They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of I'm just going to say music. They list 18 different instruments unnecessarily. Every kind of music. You said that they should fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And that's something I didn't mention. Nebuchadnezzar's like, you're going to come and worship this golden image at the expense of, if you don't, you're going to die. Okay? So when we're talking about choice here, there really isn't much. Verse 12, there are certain Jews among you, or certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And what I find so interesting about what they're doing is they're supposed to worship all the same things. But they're playing to a man who is so certain about his power. And they're saying they don't worship your, in essence saying that they're doing something against you. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear this, now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image. Oh yeah, does it say it up there? Yeah, see that? Hornpipe, lyre, trigon. What's a trigon? Harp, bagpipe. They had bagpipes then? Okay, anyways, music. If you're ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. That's totally fine. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace, and who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? And this is where this is the first kind of place that I want to focus on, because what we see is, actually let me say something else. I'm going to immediately turn all of you against me as I tell this story. But there was this game back in February, I believe it was, and it was this really important game, kind of one of the biggest games of the year, and there was two teams playing. One was expected to win, the other wasn't, but now it was flipped, right? The team that was not expected to win was in the lead in the third quarter with 2 minutes left, and the score was 28-3. And my Patriots were down 28-3, right? The Falcons were up by 25 points. Wow, math. 25 points, right? With 2 minutes left in the third quarter and 15 minutes left in the fourth. That's all that the Patriots had, right? What's interesting is you watch the Falcons and their whole game, they were playing so well. I mean, it was impressive. But then what happens is they get in the lead, and the stakes have increased dramatically. Because the thing is when you're not expected to win and you're doing really well, right, you have nothing to lose. At this point, it's hey guys, if we win, we lose, whatever. But they're in front by so much that not only is it oh, now no one expects something from us, now everyone expects you to win. And the stakes have gotten to this point where everyone is expecting them to win. And if you watch the game, you watch the Falcons collapse. And I don't say that to be mean. I say that because what happened was they started to overthink everything. When you start to overthink things because you're afraid of losing, you start thinking like, what if I lose it? What if I lose it? And you start overthinking. You got to make sure you're doing the right thing. You start doing all these things that you didn't usually do. And they started to make mistake after mistake after mistake. And Patriots come back 28-28 at the end of the fourth, and they win it in overtime. And I was reading a book. It's called The Power of Habit, and it's all about habits, and it's literally titled The Power of Habit. So, but it's all about habit forming. And one of the stories in there is about a guy named Tony Dungy, and some of you may know the name. He's a coach in football. He used to coach the Colts. Anyways, when he first got into coaching, there was this, there's this bad team, not very good, and what he decided to do is I'm going to work with these individual players at individual positions, and I'm going to just simply going to work on habit forming. That's it. I'm just going to work on forming habits, right? So what he did is when you see this trigger, do this. When you see this trigger, do this. And he just formed a bunch of habits, and they started building those over and over and over and over and over again. Well, within a couple years, this team that would never go to the playoffs was now in the playoffs, right? They had formed some really good habits. Tony Dungy is coaching them in the playoffs, and they haven't been there forever. Well, guess what? They got to the playoffs, and they collapsed miserably. Why? Well, it's because when Tony Dungy was watching his players play, he noticed that now they're in the playoffs, the stakes are high, they started to go back to the habits that they had previously. They started going back to their bad habits. They were reverting back to things that he had taught them not to do. Why? Because when the stakes are high, you go back to what you know. That's why in the army, you're trained over and over and over and over and over again to do simple things, because when you're under fire, you're going to revert back to really simple things. Well, the problem is that we revert back to things that we've built over time, and we're the same way as humans, right? When you're a kid, at least when I was a kid, the easiest way to get out of being in trouble was to make excuses, right? Like, it's not my fault. Like, this is why I did this. So this is whatever This is why. This is the reason. This is not my fault. Well, even today, when I feel like something is my fault, what do I revert back to? Because now my reputation is at stake, and now my pride is at stake. And so it's so much easier to revert back to just making excuses than it is to own up and take responsibility. Right? It's the same thing. We see this with when you're a kid and someone's annoying and a jerk, right? The easiest thing, instead of confronting them, is to just simply talk about them behind their back. Right? Well, guess what happens when all of us adults get to workplaces where you need to confront things head on and you need to be honest with people? Well, guess what everybody does? Well, this person. Because it's the easiest way. And when the stakes are high, like, I don't want to confront them, because then I'm going to look weird and people are going to look at me bad and all this stuff. And so we don't want to confront them, and the stakes get higher, and we revert back to the things that we did over and over and over and over again, especially as children. And the problem is we then bring this into God, right? Like, we bring this into our worship with God, right? When the stakes are high, we start to worship. Actually, sorry, I just totally skipped something. We revert back to things that we know because they're good coping mechanisms for us, right? They help us cope. I cope with feeling like it might be my fault by acting like it's not, by making excuses for it not being my fault. We cope with not being able to have the guts to confront someone up front by talking about them behind their back. And we have these coping mechanisms that we start to worship. And that's the problem, is when we bring this into our worship of God, we start to worship the power of our coping mechanisms as opposed to worshiping God. We start to worship the power of our coping mechanisms instead of worshiping the power of our God, right? And so when there's trouble at home, like, instead of worshiping God and saying, God, I believe that you can get me through this and you can help me and you can give me the strength, I start to worship my work because it's a good distraction and it's a good coping mechanism for my trouble at home. When we feel insecure about ourselves, we start to worship the praise of others, because it's a lot easier to get praise face to face from others than it is to believe that God still loves me in spite of my own insecurities. And we start to worship the power of our coping mechanisms because it's what has gotten us this far, as opposed to worshiping the power of our God. And in this story, what we're seeing here is these guys, like these guys, not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the other guys. And think about this: if you have a culture, an empire that's built on power and wealth and all this stuff, it's not built on like love your neighbor. So what you're going to do is any way that you can, you're going to try and get ahead. And so these guys who see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just hanging out and chilling on the side, just like, yeah, we're not going to bow down, not a huge deal. They see these guys and they're like, well, if we go to Nebuchadnezzar, then he's going to look at us, he's going to be like, well, thank you. I'm going to elevate you to the positions that they vacated by being burnt to death, right? Like, that's what I'm going to do. And these guys had built these coping mechanisms of if I do this, then I can get ahead, and that will help me. But what we see with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is something completely and utterly different. They hadn't built coping mechanisms. They had just built a trust in God. See, what happens, like, remember the first story where we find them in Daniel chapter 1, they're in exile, they've been captured, they're in slavery, and this guy's like, hey, we'll do good stuff for you. I'm going to give you the best food in the entire empire. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel are just like, nah, we're good. Like, we'll actually just kind of eat our vegetables and we'll drink our water. You can have the wine, you can have the meat, you can do all of that stuff. And they believe that if they were faithful to God in that he was going to show, he's going to prove himself to people. And they believed that. And guess what? God proved himself to them. Then you come to Daniel with interpreting the dream, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are still part of that because Daniel says to them, hey guys, will you go pray? I'll pray too, and then we're going to hope that God speaks through me or else we're all dead. And guess what? God comes through for them. Because these guys now, they hadn't built these coping mechanisms where it's like, oh no, I'm in trouble, so I'm going to blame someone else, or I'm going to try and scratch my way to get ahead in this place. And guess what? When they worship God, where did they find themselves? They found themselves in positions of influence in this nation. But now all of a sudden, the stakes have risen dramatically. It went from being like, oh, hey, we don't really have, what's the worst that happens to us if we don't eat the king's food? You're just going to be like, oh, you didn't eat the king's food, fine, whatever, right? To all of a sudden, like, you're going to die in a fire. Like, I'm going to throw you in a furnace. And the stakes have risen dramatically, but the thing is they have not built unhealthy coping mechanisms previously in their problems. And so now when they come to the biggest problem, when the stakes are the highest, they only have one coping mechanism, and it's to trust in God. And the only reason God is a good coping mechanism is because he's the only one who can do anything about it. And we see, and I'm not going to get here yet, but we see that they say, we're not going to worship, we're not going to do it. But I think for a lot of us, it's actually the moments where the stakes are the smallest that end up killing us the most. Because what happens is when that person wrongs us and we want to trust in ourselves and like, I need to hold a grudge against them because like they've just wronged me in such a bad way and I need them to know it, and we hold a grudge because that's the way we want to do it instead of worshiping God and saying, okay, God, you've told me to forgive and forgive and love them. Like, that's where the stakes are low. Like, what's at stake there? Me getting justice, I guess? But that's not even a big deal. But the stakes are low, but we still follow our own ways. So we start worshiping ourselves or we start worshiping other gods. It's when we trust in getting our own way by making like, oh, this is I've just seen this and I've noticed this in myself over my life, is that it's so much easier when you're arguing with someone or whatever, is to get that last word in, like that last like cutting remark, and just be like, well, yeah, because you're an idiot, type of thing. Like just whatever it is, and you just get that little thing in because it makes you feel like you got your way, you got your nick in, and then what? You made it worse, right? Instead of worshiping God's way and being kind and compassionate and caring to people and not having to get our way. It's when we trust in the idea that like getting 15 minutes more of sleep in the morning is going to be better than following God and worshiping God by spending time with Him in the morning. Like these are the times when the stakes are small. And when the stakes are small and we are reverting back to our coping mechanisms that we've built over our entire life, what happens when it gets to the real stuff? What happens when it gets to the places where at work, like our values are now at stake? Like what happens to the point when our marriage is at stake? What happens to the point, what happens when we get to the big parts of our life? We've been worshiping other things the whole time, and now we get to these places where it's so much easier to cope with all of our coping mechanisms than it is to trust God that He's going to do something about it. And yet, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have not done that, so they get to this point where their lives are at stake. Their lives are at stake, And they know exactly who can, because here's the other thing too, is when the small things, when God comes through in those and proves himself in the small things, then it tells me I can believe him in him for the big things when the stakes are high. But when I don't believe him for the small things, and when he cannot prove himself to me because I haven't given him the opportunity, when I get to the point where the stakes are high, I don't have any sort of basis of trust for God. I don't have any basis of like, well, yeah, I'll worship God. I'll put him in the driver's seat of my life, but I don't trust him at all. It's like putting a 14-year-old in your driver's seat when they've never ever driven a car before. It's like, that's your level of trust in God. You think he's going to do that to you. But when you put God in that driver's seat in the small things, you realize, like, man, he's good. He's real good. And they knew that when the stakes were high, like the higher the stakes, the more glorious the deliverance, but the smaller the stakes, God will form habits in your life that allow you to worship whenever and wherever and in whatever circumstance you're in. So we got to worship no matter the stakes. That's the first thing. When things get tough, we got to worship no matter the stakes, whether they're big, whether they're small. Doesn't matter which one. You have to worship in both because they both matter. But then we get to this next part in verse 16 through 18 because they've just been told, if you don't worship, you're going to be thrown in a fiery furnace. Then we get to verse 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, if you are going to throw us in that furnace, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, and some translations say, but even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I don't know why, I don't know how I have so many football references today, because I literally, that did not mean to. But I was watching this show one time on some channel, and it was What If? And it was on the NFL Network or something like that. What if? And it was the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. Not that most sports broadcasting isn't dumb, because it's just like, how do you think you did today? I thought we did good or bad, depending on the score. You know, I mean, it's just like, it's just dumb. Anyways, but they had this show, What If? And it was all about, what if something hadn't or had happened? It was like, this is literally what we call an exercise in futility, because like what they were going off of was back in 2001. I'm going to bring up the Patriots again. I know you all hate me already, so I'm just going to do it. Back in 2001, Tom Brady, a new quarterback, he's about to throw a pass, but he starts to bring the ball back towards his chest. But the problem was, Josh, that there was this thing called the tuck rule, which meant that if the ball was going forward, even if it looked like he was bringing it back, it was still kind of ruled as a pass if he dropped it. So what happened was he was going for it, his arm was coming forward, a guy tackled him, he lost the ball, but because his arm was coming forward, it was ruled an incomplete pass instead of a fumble. And the Raiders had recovered the fumble, and they were really mad. The Patriots get the ball back, they go on to win the game. Needless to say, that was really controversial. The whole show was, what if that didn't happen? I was like, we don't know! Because it happened. And the thing is that two-letter word, if, is something we base our life on constantly, right? Like, what if I just had more money? Like, if my childhood had just went differently, if my spouse would just change, if I had just gotten my education, or if I had just done this type of education, if they would just do this, right? Like that, we say if so often in our lives, and the word if, and what it does is it gives us a reason to excuse the things we've done or that we failed to do, right? It gives us a reason to explain why our life is the way it is. It gives us a reason to explain why we haven't accomplished as much as we may have wanted to. It gives us a reason it gives us a reason for why we said what we said. But the best part about the word if is that the word if warps our reality of a situation. It does. It warps the reality of our situation because it lets us cast blame on places other than us. So we say things like, well, if my spouse would just change, our marriage would be better, right? And you cannot tell me if you're married you haven't thought that. Maybe you haven't acted on it, but you've at least thought that. Because it's so much easier to say, well, if that would just be different, our marriage would be better. But then we have to sit there and be like, well, but the reality of the situation is my bad attitude is contributing to about 80% of the problems in our marriage, and I don't want to admit that. And the reality is, let me just say this about marriage, I think both people in a marriage always have to have the understanding that they need to change more than the other person needs to change. It's a mutual understanding of we both need to change more than the other person needs to change. It sounds weird, but when we do that, we realize we have to become rather than get the other person to be who we want them to be. Anyway, side note, we say this and it warps the reality because it makes me believe that it's their fault rather than my fault. And that it says that it's all them, they need to figure their lives out, they need to do this, and then maybe then I'll be like, cool, yeah, I can accept you that way. We say things like, if I had more time, I would have gotten that done, when what it really is like our horrible mismanagement of time, right? But we warp the reality of it. And this is the worst, I've heard people say this, especially like high school students, I would respect them if they respected me first. And that sets me off, because it's like what it tells us, it warps our reality into this place where all of a sudden I'm important enough to be respected just inherently. Like I inherently deserve respect, but you don't deserve respect unless you respect me. And it actually makes us into a God, and that's like, I'm just putting that out there, that it makes us into a God where I deserve respect and you only get it if you give it to me. But we have all these ways where we say if, and then we use if with God, right? Like if I wasn't as busy, I'd be closer to God. Or if my church was better, I'd be more involved. Or like if God showed me proof, then I'd believe. Or if God would have come through the last time I prayed, I'd pray more. Or if God would just speak to me verbally right now, then I would do exactly what He said, right? And we do this with God. And what the word if does is it puts conditions on things, like if I was healthier, then I would be happier. If I was healthier, then I would be happier. Or if she was nicer to me, or if he was nicer to me, then I would be nicer to him. And we put these conditions on things, but what we see here in the text is that there's no condition. Because what we often want to do is we want to put the conditions on, because then it tells me like, well, it's not my fault if I didn't do it, because the condition wasn't met. And yet let me just read it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If you deliver us, or if this be so, if you throw us in the fiery furnace, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of it. And then the next verse starts out with if. And if it isn't so, and if it's not, right? Like, if you throw us in there, God will deliver us. But if He doesn't deliver us, or if He's not willing to deliver us, then I guess we'll worship your gods, right? Like that's what we usually do, because it's two contrasting conditions. Like, if she was nicer to me, then I'd be nicer to her. If she's not nice to me, then I probably won't be nice to her, right? And we do these compare and contrast. If she did this, then I would do this. But if she did this, I would do this. But the reality we see here is there's no contrasting circumstance. There's the contrasting condition, but the same then, right? If God comes through for us, or if you throw us in there, God will come through for us. But even if He doesn't, same thing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the way I view God. It doesn't change my perspective of who He is. It doesn't change that I want to worship Him, because I will still not do it. Like, they don't use if as an excuse. And we use if as an excuse all the time, because it's so easy. And this is the worst part. It's what if becomes in our life is not a conscious excuse, but an unconscious excuse. We're not usually saying, okay, God, if you do this for me, then we'll be good. But if you don't, see ya. Like, I'm out. We won't say that blatantly. But like 3 months after someone we've been praying for dies, and we're praying for their healing, and someone comes along and says, hey, how's your relationship with God? And we're just like, man, it's really kind of bad right now. And it's because most of the time we have this unconscious, pre-existing condition of if everything goes the way I want it to, and if God does what I want, and if I'm comfortable, then I will worship. If everything is the way I'd like it to be, then I'm comfortable worshiping Him. And we do that. It's an unconscious thing that we do all of the time. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're not worshiping God based on what He does. They're worshiping God because of who He is. And there's a difference there, right? There's this difference. And they say, like, they're not worshiping based on the results. They're worshiping, this is the worst part about this. I saw this in my notes, and I've completely forgot this. But this is the worst part about worshiping based on the results, is that I get tossed around by whatever result comes my way, or whatever my interpretation of the result is, right? So sure, like you were praying to God, and you're just like, God, I love this woman. I want to be with this woman for the rest of my life. Like, please, like, make this happen. And then it doesn't happen, right? And now you're sitting there like, God, why didn't this happen? You're kind of mad. You don't know if you can trust him, and you're just frustrated. And so for like the next 3 years, you just don't pray very often. But then 3 years later, you meet this new girl, and you're like, whoa, that other girl was super untrustworthy. And I'm so much better off now. But the problem is my interpretation of the first circumstance meant that I didn't worship God for like 3 years until I realized that it ended up well. And we'll do that. We'll wait until the result is good before we worship. And that's such an issue for us, because then we're sitting there like tossed around by the waves of our life. Well, this went well, and so I can worship God now, but this isn't going well, so I don't know where I should be today. And it becomes such a problem. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're like, it doesn't matter what my interpretation of the result is, because God is good no matter what the result is. And the reality is and this is another bad thing that happens in our world, is that sometimes things happen and they don't have a purpose, right? Like there's things in this world, can I just say this, that there's things in this world that don't have some greater purpose. The reality of death is there's not a greater purpose to it inherently in it. But what I can tell you is that God creates purpose out of places that were meant to have no purpose. So yeah, like someone, like yes, I'm sick and I don't have my health and I don't have any of this. And what we'll do is we'll get bitter at God because the results aren't turning out how I want it to. But what we don't realize is that though there may not be some sort of greater purpose, God wasn't like, I'm going to make you sick. I'm going to get you sick. I'm going to do it. So then you'll learn something. But rather it's you got sick and I'm going to make something good out of it. And God will do that in our life. And so instead of getting bitter because the results aren't like how we want them to be, what if we worshiped before the results ever came along? Because we know that whatever happens, God is going to make it into something good. I don't know if y'all heard me on that. Like the result doesn't matter, because whatever happens as a result of it is going to be good. We may not escape the pain and the hurt and all of that, but the end result of it is always going to be good. And I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego realized that the results don't matter, that we have to worship in spite of the results. We got to worship no matter the results. Maybe not, we got to worship no matter the stakes, but even more so, we got to worship no matter the results. And I think for some of you today who are in a place where you're just like, I don't know what to do, I don't know what God's going to do, I'm frustrated, I'm in the middle of this, I need something, and you're waiting for the result to happen. You're waiting for the result on whether or not you can worship or not. But I want to tell you something today. You got to stop worshiping an outcome, and you got to start worshiping the God who can overcome. Like we worship our outcomes, we worship the result, and then we wait to see if the result is like how we want it to be, then I'll worship God, but we forget that God is a God who can overcome. So don't worship the outcome, worship the God who can overcome. Worship no matter the stakes, but worship no matter the results. And we come to this last bit, and this is where we kind of come to the end of the story. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're just like, no, we're not going to worship. No matter what you say, we're not going to do it. And Nebuchadnezzar is mad. It says Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. And in verse 22, we see this guy, and this is a side note. What we'll often do is when Nebuchadnezzar, this guy who's all about himself and all about his selfishness and worshiping himself, when we worship ourselves, we lose a sense of our care for others, of our empathy for others. And what happens is Nebuchadnezzar, he's mad and he's angry because these guys are defying him. He gets the fiery furnace heated up 7 times hotter than it should have been. And he sends these guards to take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them in the fiery furnace, and they die because it's so hot. But that doesn't matter because Nebuchadnezzar wants to throw these guys in the furnace. And we got to be careful because when we worship ourselves, we start losing our empathy for others. But then this is verse 24, and this is where the story starts to change. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" And they answered, "Yeah, that's true, O king." He answered them and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants," I said Abednego, "servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over their bodies, and the hair of the heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered them and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." Nebuchadnezzar has a huge whoa. Something crazy just went down in this guy's heart. This is going to sound really off topic, but do you know Newton's first law of motion? A body that is in motion will remain in motion unless it's acted upon. There's a song, and this is where most of this comes from. There's a song by a guy named John Mark McMillan. He's the guy who wrote How He Loves, if you're curious. But there's a song, and it's on his new CD. It's called Body in Motion. I was listening to the song, and literally the chorus of the song is him just saying that line, like Newton's first law of motion. I'm like, what in the world is he talking about? A body that is in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon. But you start listening to the whole song, and you start realizing he's talking about humanity. He's talking about how we as humanity are a body in motion, and we're headed wholeheartedly and completely in a direction. And we have all of this momentum headed in one direction, and it's towards death. It's sin. It's all this stuff. We are wholeheartedly headed towards destroying ourselves. That's what we're doing. Whether we know it or not, whether it's subtle, simple, not obvious, whatever it is, we're doing it. And we've been doing it since we messed up in the Garden of Eden. We've been doing that. And his whole point is that body is going to remain in motion unless it's acted upon. And what Christianity will claim is that we are a body of people headed the opposite direction, right? That we're trying to exert some sort of force on this momentum of humanity, and we're trying to head it the opposite direction. But then the worst part about it is that as Christians, we claim to worship a God of peace. But then we found out, and none of what I'm going to say is trying to be political, but I just want to make a point. We find out just a little while ago that Christians are totally fine saying, well, let's carpet bomb our enemies. I thought Jesus said, love your enemies. Well, yeah, but they want to hurt us. When did that change? When did the statement, love your enemies, change? The worst part is we're Christians who claim to worship a God of justice, but we're totally fine with injustice unless it affects us. Right? I'm fine with social and economic equality unless, don't tell me to bake a cake for a same-sex couple. Then I'm being persecuted. Christians claim to worship a God who is powerful, but then we'll go nuts over, the smallest tiny thing. Christians claim to worship a God of love, but we don't really love our neighbors, let alone sometimes our family, let alone our enemies. Christians claim to worship a God who laid down his life for all people, but we won't even lay down our judgmental attitudes for one. I mean, what if Christians aren't really exerting a ton of force the opposite direction? What if the body of humanity is headed the same direction as Christians, and we're all headed towards the same goal? And my point now is not to get down on us as Christians, but rather to make it very clear that unless some sort of force is exerted in a very opposite direction, humanity is going someplace really quick. And the reality is that the only way people's lives are going to be changed, the only way a force is going to be exerted in the opposite direction is if people see something overwhelmingly opposite of what they know. It's the only way it's going to happen. The only way the motion of the body of humanity begins to go the opposite direction is if there's a force exerted in the opposite direction. And the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is so countercultural that it does two things. It makes Nebuchadnezzar so mad that he'd throw him in a fiery furnace, and then it makes him so crazy that they would come out of there and he would love them. And he would be like, I need to know more about this. Like, I'm saying things I don't even fully understand. Like, God is amazing, God is great, God is big. And I don't even know what I'm saying. I don't know who I'm talking about. I just know that I've seen something crazy. Because their faith and their actions were so countercultural. Their worship of God led them to do things that seemed insane. And yet in the midst of it, something was shown completely different than everything else. And that's what we see. Like Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command. Like Nebuchadnezzar is like, you guys like didn't listen to me, and it really turned out well. It's just like that's not where he would normally be if he hadn't seen what he saw. But what it's going to take for us as Christians to begin to change the world is for us to worship God instead of fearing the fire. Like we fear the fire as Christians. We fear the fire of persecution, right? And so we'll cry, like we'll be like, I'm a martyr, when someone like an atheist is like, I don't agree with this part of your faith. Martyrdom! They don't love us, they don't like us. Like we'll cry persecution for like the littlest thing just because we're afraid of the fire of it. We're afraid of the fire of sickness so much that we become bitter with God because we feel like He's let us down when we face it. We're afraid of, like instead of facing the fire of difficult circumstances in our life with faith, believing that God has the power to do something about it, we just worship other things to avoid the fire. Like we will not love our enemies because that's too hard, right? Because then we might suffer. Jesus kind of died on a cross because He loved His enemies. And if we're called to do the same exact thing as He did, then when we worship God, we should be led into literally giving up our lives to the people around us. And that's something we don't want to do. It's so difficult because it's so countercultural, and yet because we're afraid of the fire, guess what? Everybody else is afraid of the fire. And if we're all afraid of the fire together, we're all going to try and avoid it. And yet what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego realized is that they were not going to avoid the fire, but they had a God who could get them through the fire. And people will only see a different, overwhelmingly opposite force if they see people who are not afraid of the fire. People who are not afraid of the fire, not afraid of difficulty, not afraid of trial. Like, what if people saw Christians? Let me not even say what if. I've seen Christians, people who are not afraid of death because it means nothing to them, because they're going to see Jesus the next step, right? People who aren't afraid of trial because it just seems to embolden them. It makes them stronger for some reason. People who have joy when every single thing in their life is crashing down around them and they're like, God is good. And just like, no, that's not possible. God is good. How will you believe this? I just do. I believe God is good. People have underlying certainty in the midst of so much uncertainty. Let me just tell you this, church. We have to worship no matter the stakes. We have to worship no matter the results. But we have to worship because it's the only way we change the world. We worship a God instead of worshiping the fire. We talked about this the first week. I'm about to close. We've talked about this the first week. There's three things. There's three words that are translated as worship in the Old and New Testament. And it's words like to bow down, words like to serve, and words like to fear. And guess what? Whatever we're afraid of, we worship. And if we're afraid of the fire, we're worshiping the fire and what it can do to us more than we worship God. We can't be afraid of the fire. We can't be afraid of people looking at us and saying, you're crazy, you're nuts. Because it's through that fire that we show God the most. The main point of this whole thing, like the main point of this entire whole thing, is that when we worship, we find power and strength that shouldn't be possible. In verse 24, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said, That's true. He answered them and said, But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. When we're afraid of the fire, we miss walking with Jesus in the fire. When we worship God instead of worshiping the fire, we find power, strength, wisdom, joy, the fruits of the Spirit, things that we don't understand, and enables us to walk in the fire instead of being afraid of it and worshiping God just to avoid the fire. That's what I want to encourage us today. We're going to sing one more song. But before we sing this song, I want to say this. Worship will dictate the direction we go. Worship will dictate the direction we go. Worship will dictate the direction we go. And that's why it matters so much. Because whoever I'm worshiping is influencing my actions. The old gods that they used to worship, we do the same thing. We don't want to turn into that. We want to be home. We don't want to be somewhere else. But last, we have to worship in the midst of trial. No matter the stakes, no matter the results, and because it changes the world around us.
Interesting, that furnace was probably the furnace they used to make the statue. You know, it was probably refined the gold, and it ended up refining the king. In this song, there's a verse that talks about a child has to learn to crawl, and that when we start to walk, we will fall. You know, if we never, it's been fun because we have a granddaughter. I think all of you know that, and we love that. You know, crawling is a skill that she learned, but you know, she learned it with her with her legs first. So she would crawl and she'd fall over on her shoulder, then she'd get up and she'd fall off the other shoulder. Now she got all figured out. She got all four working together. So I invite you to meditate on the words of this song. You can sit if you want or stand if you want. I think it's really a significant song. You know, as we're born again, that means we aren't adults in the faith. It means we're starting in our faith to crawl, then to walk, then to run, then to teach other people how to crawl, walk, and run.
Weak and wounded sinner, lost and left and I, raise your head, for love is passing by. Come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come to Jesus and live. Like burdens lifted and carried far away, and precious blood has washed away the stain. So sing to Jesus, sing to Jesus, sing to Jesus and live. Like a newborn baby, don't be afraid to crawl. Remember when you walk, sometimes you'll fall. So fall on Jesus, fall on Jesus, fall on Jesus and live. Sometimes the way is lonely and steep and filled with pain. So if your sky is dark and pours the rain, then cry to Jesus, cry to Jesus, cry to Jesus and live. When the lust spills over and music fills the night, and when you can't contain the joy inside, then dance for Jesus, dance for Jesus, dance for Jesus and live. And when you see him coming, kiss the world goodbye. Then go in peace and laugh on
want to give us the opportunity today. We're at the close of our series on worship. And I know for a lot of us, worship is difficult, ambiguous, frustrating sometimes because it just feels like we're saying things. But I want to encourage you guys on this, that worship, when we do it before the results, before everything happens, before everything goes wrong, whatever it is, it centers our heart in a place that Satan really can't touch. I mean, Satan can't touch your spirit. He can't touch your perspective on God unless you want to let him do that. And what worship does is it centers us on who God is, and it doesn't matter what happens around us. It literally doesn't, because we know God and we're worshiping him. We know who he is. We know what he's done. We know who we are in relation to him, and we know that he's a good father who wants to give us whatever we need. And we can rest in that. And so I want to encourage you today. I just want to ask you to do something physical as a response. And so what we're going to do is, if we could all close our eyes. And if there's a place in your life where you just feel like you are worshiping things that are not God, I don't want you to raise your hand high. I just want you to put your hand out. If you feel like there's a place in your life, you just put your hand out a little ways and just say, God, I'm in need. I'm in need right now because I'm just worshiping things that aren't you, and it's not putting me in a good place. And if you're someone who's in a place where it feels like everything is going wrong, and it feels like you're trying to do all the right things, and it feels like you've been trying for a long time and stuff is still going wrong, I want you to put your other hand out. I want you to just say to God, God, listen, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep trying like this, and I can't keep feeling like this and having this spirit where I just am not going anywhere. And if you're someone who is, and you can put your hands down, if you're someone who is genuinely trying to worship God and just struggling to connect, I want you to put your hand out. I want you to say to God that, listen, God, I need you, and I need to know you better. I need to be with you, and I want to know how I can connect with you better. And last, and this is what I want to do for us as a close to the entire service. If you want to commit your life to a lifestyle of worship, towards building a lifestyle of worship, where it doesn't matter what the stakes are, it doesn't matter what the results are, if you want to commit your life to worshiping God in every way, of putting God in that driver's seat of your life and saying, I want you there, I want you guiding me, and I want you to raise your hand in the air. And I know it may seem like the most obvious thing for us to do, God, that we want to raise our hands and say, yeah, we want to worship you. And the reality is that the next steps are the harder parts. But Lord, you've seen every hand that's raised in this room, and you know the hearts that are going along with those raised hands. And you know, Lord, that we truly desire above all things to put you first. And yet, Lord, there are so many difficult circumstances and things in our life that keep us from doing it. But I want to ask today, God, that you would show us your power in ways that astound us, Lord, that you would work in the little tiny things, that you would work on our hearts so that we would let you do those small things, so that we can learn to trust you for the big things. God, I just ask that you would, wherever someone is in the middle of trial, whether in the middle of a really good time, that you would be working on our hearts and bringing us to that worship of you, whether the stakes are small, whether they're big, whether the times are good, whether they're bad, whether the fire is huge, whether it's small, whatever it is, God, I just ask that you would be working on our hearts, working on us so that we would put you in the driver's seat in every step of our life. Because we need that. And without you, when we worship other gods, we end up in places we don't want to be, Lord. I look forward to the time that you're going to take us home. But Lord, today, I ask that you would help people in this room who feel like they're exiled, feel like they're far away from you. I ask that you would help them to feel at home with you right now. Lord, I thank you so much for everything that you've done for us. I thank you for everything that you're going to do in our lives. I'm so excited to see what you do in this church. I'm so excited to see what you do in this town, in this city, in this world. Whatever you're going to do, Lord, I'm excited to see it, Lord, but just help us to be part of it. Help us to desire to be part of it, because the only way this world is going to be changed is if it sees Christians who aren't afraid of the fire. Help us to not be afraid of the fire, Lord. Thank you. In your name, amen. You can sit down. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to have these sheets at the back here. What they are is we've been going through adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication in our service. I just wanted to give you a kind of more practical way that you can apply that at home. So if you want to, they're going to be here in the back, and I'll be in the back there shaking your hands. But you can just ask for one, I'll have that for you. So happy Sabbath, and we'll see you later.